Please note, this session is being recorded.
It's noted.
Hey everyone. My name is Mark, and this is Kumar and Joe, and we're bored during the quarantine. We're going to talk about religion and politics and record it. So Kumar's got a great topic that should be really engaging to a lot of people. What's been on your mind, Kumar?
So, it's been on my mind for quite a while. It's not specifically related to the quarantine or anything, but just it's a take on religion that's sort of built on my understanding of it as being an immigrant coming from India and having experienced religion over there and over here, and specifically what religion is like or the part it's played in sort of political reform and how people around me experience it versus what it is. That was a lot of words to say. My main thesis is that I feel like I'm a leftist myself. Um, that a lot of my fellow leftists, in completely either discounting or being anti-religion, they're throwing out one of the main allies for social reform, and one of the honest allies too. My argument is this perceived dishonesty that's found in religion is one, overblown, and two, not very accurate. That's my argument.
So you think secularism has gone too far in leftist communities?
So that statement that secularism has gone too far sort of implies secularism sort of drives itself and it just accidentally went too far, which I think there's an element of it, but also I think that in their efforts to sort of move away from some of the problems religion faced, that they threw the baby out with the bathwater, but also that historically, that, what should I say, bad people tend to win when good people move away from religious movements and sort of distance themselves from ways of organizing around moral issues.
Would you agree, though, that, so I may be, or I'll play the role, I'm going to play it pretty well because I think I identify with it, the role of an anti-religious person on the left.
Godless atheist.
There you go.
Communist, fascist.
Do you think that some of that reaction comes from the way that the right has sort of co-opted a certain flavor of religion?
Definitely, 100%. I would say it has come from it. That the loudest voices in religion have tended to be homophobic, xenophobic, anti-intellectual, templates like Betsy DeVos or whoever that Liberty University asshole is. Yeah,
throwing down Betsy real early in this podcast season. Glad we got to her. Glad we could name drop the first political name we dropped is Betsy Davos.
But things like that would obviously turn people away. One, if you're one of the communities that you're being spoken against, and even if not, just seeing other people picked on or this sort of very external, aggressive form of Christianity can be a turnoff. But my answer to that then is, historically, a lot of my leftist friends who are anti-religion tend to also be not big fans of libertarians. They tend to see libertarians as naive, that libertarians in their legitimate sort of beginning gripes with or skepticism of government, their solution of complete disengagement actually worsens the problem than trying to reform it. Similarly, I would say when shitty people like that are taking over the religion, the solution of then distancing yourself away from it is to sort of let them take these institutions, these movements, and run with it and to seed the ground. So I can understand the psychological level of why that might sort of push people away. But as far as if we're trying to sort of approach this in a more systematic way and understanding consequences, We need to be doing the opposite. When we see shitty people trying to take over religions, we need to be engaging with the religious much more consistently and sort of within that realm more consistently to sort of ensure it doesn't get co-opted.
I think that makes sense. My reaction to a lot of the religious right has often been, man, it offends me in some ways.
Mhm.
But if I was a Christian, I would be way more offended at people taking a cornerstone or a big part of my life and perverting it. That would be, because I don't fall into that category. I'm not offended by bad actors in that category necessarily as much as someone who does fall in that category. As a person of faith, is that your feeling, Mark? Like, aren't you even more deeply offended by someone like for example, when not Y2K, when 9/11 happened and Jerry Falwell said something along the lines of, "This is because of homophobics." I'm sorry, this is because of gays, homosexuals, atheists.
Yeah, no. So anytime someone uses God for a purpose to perpetuate hate, I think that's certainly, as particularly like Christian God, right? And that's been done throughout history. I do want to back up. I think this conversation about how the left doesn't have God, if you want to simplify it like that, right? Or at least they don't outwardly identify with that as a cultural or as a constituent group. I think you can trace. You have to look at history in the United States, American history, and it wasn't really till Carter, in some ways afterwards, that there really was this kind of modern resurgence of, at least in my view, there's obviously Christianity in America has been building throughout, but where you see kind of that evangelical aligned with the conservative right. That amalgamation, in my mind, really has built. I guess you could say since the latter part of the 1900s, and 1950 and onwards. And so it's a fairly recent phenomenon that was something that is, we sort of take that for granted, right? If throughout 2000s and before then, you kind of had that, I guess, personified, the strongest in Newt Gingrich, where that became kind of the blossoming bud that you saw, at least in my mind, right? There's other examples of it. So it's not necessarily that this has always been true, right? I can think of the civil rights movement, and certainly in the African American communities, faith is a central part of kind of progressive politics, as it were. I don't mean to be cliche, but Martin Luther King and a lot of those movements have been identified with that. So I think it is a fairly recent phenomenon that the left, quote unquote left, has not had God or use that language. It's not like, I don't think that people on the left are inherently less spiritual or have values or morals. I think some of the things that are advocated by the left are seen as an affront to evangelical leaders on the right. So if you're talking about the most flashpoint issue, you could talk about abortion, right? Yeah. So the way that it's framed on the left is substantially different than the way it's framed on the right. So murder is different than someone's bodily autonomy, right? And those are both seen as just things within those communities. And there's really not a dialogue, because those are kind of seen as ultimate inherent goods that you can't compromise on. And so for touch button issues like that, you can start extending into other things like homosexuality or homophobia, or a lot of other cultural tendrils where you find the strongest outcroppings, I think, in very charismatic Christian communities, right? And so those become the loudest in the chamber of what might not be representative of a full spectrum of Christianity. So I think it's certainly been used to political and power ends more effectively on the right. And because I'm not necessarily convinced that the right, or however you want to define that, conservative, are inherently more spiritual or more.
I'm not making that argument. I would actually make the opposite argument.
Right.
But
I certainly think, just to finish my thought, I think they've used it more effectively, and the left has seen that as being maybe a market that's been cornered. I don't know if you want to describe it like that. And so where can we find our other constituency that we can serve or motivate? Like that's a sunk cause. They've already won that. And I guess what you're saying is maybe we should that ground shouldn't be ceded, right? Or there's use in exploring that as a means to perpetuate or kind of advance agendas, right? Because it's not just saying, you're not just saying that the left needs to embrace Christianity or spiritual things. It's that they need to be more interwoven in their meetings, in their discussion, in their ideology, right?
In their ideology, in their outreach, and in their
right,
and in their language. So, and I'm not arguing that this is a historical problem with the left, because, like you were saying, if you look at Martin Luther King, if you look at Gandhi, if you look at Srinath in Kerala, where I come from, a lot of leftist movements, they've been built off of very spiritual sort of base institutions and organizations. They have historically been in the background of some of the main ones leading these things. And I see this problem of moving away from all religious talk and like orientation as more of a modern problem, like you were saying, like maybe in the last 30, 40 years. And what should I say? It's
But that kind of correlates with around the Nixon Southern Strategy era, doesn't it?
it does. Well, my
around the
argument,
Nixon Southern Strategy. Can you say more about that, Joe? What do you mean?
The idea being, in order to get the South, we're going to appeal to elements of racism. Before, and I think all of us grew up in Georgia, or all three of us. Well, Kumar, his latter childhood years.
I was born in Detroit, so my latter childhood years too.
Well, I forgot. I forgot about Eminem then. So before Carter and Nixon, the South, and actually before that, the South was pretty lowercase d or capital D Democrat. Nixon, who I think was a political genius in a lot of ways, horrible individual in my opinion, but a political genius, decided to go in and, through appealing to mostly the fear and racism of Southerners, bring them into the Republican camp. Religion played a big part in that, I think, because it's sort of, when you're trying to convince people, poor people in the South, to give up their economic interests, you have to give them something else to come in on. And you're white, so are we. We get you. Isn't it crazy? All these scary blacks around you. You need to start voting Republican. I think that's a big wave of that shift.
But how does that? So I understand. Okay, so I understand what you're saying about employing like inbred or like baked in fears that maybe folks in the South might have. But how does that relate to, I guess, the expression of evangelicalism or I don't know, the outward identity of being a Christian and supporting politics? That tends to be a rare duck, right? On the left, you don't see that much. Jimmy Carter was probably the first that you saw in that sphere. So how does that, just so that I can tie together more concretely, like, because I think I know what you're saying, that there is kind of that element of revivalism, or I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of hard to place words exactly around it.
like ethno-Christianity.
Ethno-Christianity.
Yeah. Yes. There was a great book written about it recently, or not that recent anymore. What was it? God in Walmart or something like that. In order to appeal to, let's say people in the South, poor people in the South, you need something about them that already exists, and to appeal to that. Whiteness and religion were huge. So bring me on, and I'm open to your ideas about economics, your ideas about guns, your ideas about the Fed, if you can get me on board with those core things that I have, my whiteness and my religion. Now, is it a different sort of flavor of religion? Yeah. But if you redefine being a good Christian in a certain way that makes me sort of like jump ship onto your ship, that's how you're going to do it.
So inherent in that, though, is some sort of threat, right?
Yeah, I think
Like
it's fear-based.
there's an outward threat, or at least that's the way that I interpret it.
I agree.
That no one is standing up to.
Perceived threat. A perceived threat.
Perceived threat.
It doesn't have to necessarily be actual. I think that's where you find bullshit on Fox News, like the war on Christmas and things like that.
Great example.
But the perception might have some hints of truth to it. The best lies are built on truth to a degree. And we can't just look back at the last 20 years and not recognize that the new atheist movement and sort of not just atheistic, but like anti-theist movements were aligned more with the left than the right, heavily so.
Well, and I think there's two big things that I'm ignoring that I shouldn't have ignored. Number one, I don't know that much about Christianity, but from what I can tell, it seems very in line with progressive politics. It seems to favor inclusiveness. It seems to favor a sense of solidarity, community, helping those in need. So, in order to knock that out of people who are very religious, you have to redefine their identities as religious people, sort of. That's number one. Number two, we're also kind of forgetting that one of the fastest growing demographics in America is those that don't claim any religion. And I think that I have no idea where they're going politically. I think some of them are either going to the left or to the American flavor of libertarianism. But that's a big factor in this whole equation too. And nerds. We're also having a serious increase in nerds in America too. I forget about that one.
I think there's almost a self-sorting too. So for whatever reason, why there is, so you could examine all the historical and contextual reasons why conservatism is more associated with religion. Number one, there's a lot of just kind of family values issues that fit nicely into the category of religion and preserving that. Again, it's about preserving and maintaining religion in even the most progressive religions, right? They have to have some sort of ritual and things that perpetuate itself. So there is a notion in, and I know you can bring up certainly other religions, which I know you're itching to do, Kumar. But I believe religions try to perpetuate themselves. There's an inherent conservative nature to that.
You mean like lowercase c, like based on tradition kind of thing?
Yeah. So they want to maintain and preserve that which is held in esteem. And conservatism, if you're looking at it with a generous lens, that's what they want to do. They want to maintain what's great or good about what's existing in America and not have those institutions degrade. And if you're looking at it though from like tenets of Christianity, I think that's how it would need to be engaged if you were to attract people from the left. Because I think there's there's self-sorting that happens, right? So if you're a Christian, maybe if you're outward identifying Christian, if you're an evangelical, because that's more talked about and embraced on the right, you might naturally gravitate to that, even if those aren't maybe your politics.
Yeah.
Because there's a representation that's happening.
Yeah.
Because that does not exist on the left.
Yeah.
Someone who may support policies that may be considered left or progressive, they may not feel comfortable doing that because their identity is not represented and because they don't feel safe there, right? There's not a place to talk about God without being ridiculed.
Yeah.
So I think some of it, while some of it's conscious choice and deciding, there's also this kind of passive sorting that happens where if you're an atheist, right, what's the party that's kind of more accepting of you? It's the left, right? You're not going to feel judged if you go to a soiree or like a, like a leftist like fundraiser, and you know, they don't talk about God. But if you go to a conservative fundraiser, I guarantee there's going to be some prayer or kind of devotion that happens there, just because that's the nature of the populace that makes that up. So I think it goes both ways. I think people are actively choosing or reinforcing it. And I think there's also this, like I said, passive sorting that's happening where people just align with that, whether or not their politics align in that way.
Because they have representation or if they feel safe there or not.
Right.
And even that, there seems to be sort of different layers to it, meaning like it seems that the more collectivistically oriented atheists seem to be aligning with the left, and a subsect of sort of sociopathic, individualistic oriented ones, like the libertarians, were like, have these fantasies of doom and gloom where they're going to rule over the world with their big brains. And hate God, and they're pretty actively atheistic. They seem to have right. It's like a sub-faction of the right, but I think the common factor is a sense of ethno sort of defense or something like that. I think the loss here is that a religion like Christianity was pretty effective, or could be pretty effective, in bridging racial gaps and sort of moving towards unity. And we're letting these assholes who want to build systems off of racial hegemony or class hegemony co-opt one of the main tools for breaking those hegemonies when they get corrupt. And sort of a monopolistic ownership of it in the public sphere, in the language we use. Because historically, I look at abolishing slavery. Most of the impetus comes from Christian organizations: Quakers, Presbyterians, Methodists.
Definitely.
Specifically, the most radical wings of the Christian communities. Not the scientists. The scientists aligned with the rich people who paid them to make some horseshit fucking anthropology.
Eugenics-esque.
Yeah, eugenics, science-based things where, Black Americans and blacks in general are racially and scientifically inferior, and that's why it justifies us enslaving them. It wasn't the scientists who were pushing back, hell or high water, risking their fucking lives to do something good. If I look at India, the caste system, the people who reformed that, people like Srinarayana Guru, these were people from India who aligned with Christianity and Hinduism and made a mix of the two to reform Hinduism and fix it, fix a broken social system. And again, they gained a lot of support from the Christian left. You look at Gandhi, he was heavily helped by the Christian left. You look at the civil rights movement. Science can be just as bullshit as religion based on who's doing it, who's using it, and what are the institutions built around it. But to me, on the left, there seems to be a hyper focus or awareness of the failings of religious institutions, and not enough of examination of, or like understanding that these failures are inherent to institutions and groups. And in abandoning this sort of language and group itself, we're abandoning one of our most powerful tools for equality and justice. Because I can't think of too many people who weren't somewhat religious who spent their life reforming things.
I have a little bit of a counter argument,
Okay.
and it's not. It was something I more heard in school. The idea that there was an era for religion driving change, let's say in the civil rights community specifically, that sort of ended with Barack Obama. The idea being that he brought in a secular flavor of civil rights. I think there's obviously some flaws with that, and I think that I think there was an obvious religious support for him, but he didn't carry himself as religiously as civil rights leaders in the past did. Does that make sense?
It does.
Now, I mean, I feel like all of this goes to shit in the Trump era, but I'm coming around and sort of seeing and understanding where you're coming from. That what is the left providing for some sort of an alternative to the religious right for folks who are inclined in a spiritual, religious way? I don't have a good answer right now, and I don't think the left has a good answer right now.
I think that's one of my answers and questions, sort of provocations. There's a secondary one, which is that we can recognize that certain behaviors are educational, right? Jury duty, certain things like that train you in civics, right? And we understand it. We want more of it. We want people engaged in voting, local organizations to skilled in understanding and engaging in civics. Things like sort of a globalized form of empathy and purpose. These are skills, whether it's our ability to perceive them or engage them. And religion used to play the part of training us in it. Now, it might have failed or like been doctored in X, Y, or Z ways, but that was one of its roles.
And we shouldn't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And if we are, we need to build another baby. Or like
build another baby.
Yes,
that's right. Get the fucking.
Are we talking? There's only one way to build a baby.
That I know
of. Something like that. Yeah, like
maybe the quarantine generation will be just the babies that we need.
Yeah, those babies, but also I mean in terms of spiritual thought too. So here's something I want to throw out to you, like the perspective of the religion as co-opted by corrupt leaders, oriented towards tradition and and uh, and supernatural bullshit and superstition, and the alternative is like non-religious thinking. I look at historical examples. These qualms that we have with problematic religion are not new. If you look at 600, closer to 400, 400 BC to 200 BC, you can read the Buddhist texts where they're talking about how bullshit it is that these Brahmin priests got these people convinced that rituals do things and praying for magic fucking bullshit and using language to bewitch them, right? Engaging in supernatural horseshit. And their solution wasn't, hey, let's leave the realm altogether. Their solution was to offer an alternative, an intellectually honest alternative to these questions that religion tend to sort of pretend to answer, at least on the manipulative side. I think there are honest attempts by the Christian left and center to approach these questions, whereas I find a lot of the conservative Christian angles. Some of it's honest, but nowadays a lot of it's dishonest. So the problems we're facing, like it's not new, and this has happened before. The solutions were all for within that domain that's honest and an alternative. Not just like, hey, here's some bullshit to appease you so you'll vote for us, which I think can come across as like pandering to the Christians, which is not what I'm advocating for. I'm not advocating pandering.
Yeah, I think there's some good models, and this would probably be on our second podcast. So, but I thought you were going to bring up the Quakers and different things that might serve as a model. Maybe not exactly, but like serve as a model for what that might look like in inclusive spirituality, or kind of a reframing or repurposing of religious tenets, right? Whether Christian or non-Christian. I think the idea is that this idea that organized religion doesn't necessarily mean what we've seen in the history of the United States in the last 20 years, right? That's not the only model that there is. And you can maximize benefits and minimize cost or risk to having organized religion in a way that might align with someone who's, say, more atheistic thinking, right? Or maybe questioning God, that you may find inclusion or a sense of unity in perhaps you don't even need to involve the word God, right? But you could still derive those benefits, right? So I'm thinking of a Quaker meeting where there's really no talking, there's no preaching, and it's really just kind of a communal meditation where there's words of affirmation.
There's no priesthood.
Right.
And as far as, if I could just interject and like keep going for a second. Yeah, there are models to go for what the solution looks like. There are historical examples, there are contemporary examples of things we can build out further. As far as dealing with the problem of authoritarianism, as far as approaching intellectual questions and things like that, and having the community be involved in this thing, and having something that's not xenophobic, so ethnocentric. The Quakers provide a great model, to the point where they even provide a lot of the model for even the American government's like establishment of democracy, right? Baked into organized Quaker religion is a sense of trying to combat the coalescing of power in the hands of the few, the of voting gates, things like that. And sort of barring a priesthood to sort of have a bully pulpit over others. There are ways to organize religion to bring checks and balances and get the best out, and try to mitigate what is naturally problems of religion. Similar to government, similar to what the U.S. government did with having 3 branches, having a judicial check this, having checks and balances and sort of things baked in to get the benefits of government while mitigating what is naturally some weaknesses that come from establishing a government, versus just throwing your hands up and saying government's corrupt. Well, we're not going to try it that.
Thanks guys for participating in this discussion. We'll see how this goes next time. And
great job.
Go ahead and stop this recording.
Thanks for hosting.